Hello, and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Hetan Shah, Chief Executive of the British Academy. The British Academy is a fellowship of world-leading academics, a funding body for research, and a forum for public ideas and debate. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Tim Harford, who is a world-leading economist and the presenter of More or Less, an FT journalist and well known for a variety of books that he's written and well known as the undercover economist. He has brought out a new book, 10 How to Make the World Add Up. I've got a copy here, and it's just come out, so I'm really pleased to be in conversation with Tim to discuss the new book. We're going to spend about 40 minutes in discussion, and then I'm going to open up for Q&A from you, the audience. And in the meantime, you can tweet, you can copy in the British Academy's Twitter handle, British Academy _, and both Tim and I are on Twitter as well. So Tim, welcome and thanks for joining us. Your book, How to Make the World Add Up, has just come out. So most of our viewers or listeners have probably not yet read it. So can you just give us a short summary to start?
Sure. I mean, I think nobody's read it because at the moment it's sold out in about 24 hours, and we're desperately trying to get some more copies into the bookshops. So it's people keep telling me this is a good problem to have. So what's the summary? This is a book about how to think clearly about the world using numbers. So a friend of mine said, "Oh, so it's a book about how to think about statistics." No, I think statistics are an important tool, but ultimately my aim is to help people understand the world around them. And that's what the book's about. And it's 10 rules of thumb, 10 habits of mind that I've learned while presenting More or Less over the last 13 years. And I think what makes it slightly different from a regular book about statistics is that really the lessons learned during, for example, the Brexit referendum, where I realized, I can sort of go through the numbers, we can go through the facts, look at the evidence, and actually a lot of people aren't really listening. A lot of people are being influenced by what they believed all along. They're influenced by what their friends think. They're influenced by their political identity, their cultural identity. And that's fine, of course. We're human beings. We exist in the world. We exist in society. But it made me realize that if I'm going to write a book to help people think more clearly about the world, I also need to help them think more clearly about themselves. It's not just about technical advice about statistics. It's also how to get through your own filters and biases and think calmly. To put yourself in a position where the evidence can actually change your mind, which is not a totally straightforward thing.
Great. Well, some of our viewers and listeners will have come across the book How to Lie with Statistics, which is a classic by Darrell Huff. I remember reading it when I was a teenager. And in some ways, you refer to the book in your introduction. It feels like you're positing your book as a bit of a kind of antidote to his. So can you say a bit more about the Darrell Huff book and how it relates to your own?
Yeah, you would think, well, why does anybody need to write an antidote to Darrell Huff's book? Because I read it as a teenager. It's a great book, great little book. It's funny, it's sharp, it's incisive, and it's a guide to all the ways in which statistics can lead you astray, can be deliberately used to deceive. But what I started to realize was making me uncomfortable about Darrell Huff's book was it sort of sets a trap for all of us who believe in numbers, who are numerate, who believe in the power of statistics. It's very easy to think that we're communicating about statistics, whereas in fact what we're doing is debunking false statistics. And in doing so, we're leading people to be more cynical. We're leading people to conclude that all anybody ever does is lie with statistics. Um, and that's dangerous because yes, I mean, it's important to call out lies. It's important to do that. But if that's all we do, then we're just feeding into a real cynicism. And I think Darrell Huff understood the power of his kind of quite witty skepticism very well, and he wasn't the only one who did. So he was hired by the tobacco companies in order to spread disinformation, I would guess, about tobacco. So he worked on a book paid for by the tobacco lobby called How to Lie with Smoking Statistics, which was, I think, mercifully for his reputation, was never published. And there's a famous story, How to Lie with Statistics, about how you can show that storks, statistically speaking, storks deliver babies because there's a correlation between storks and babies. And you would think, well, that's a fun joke. That's a great illustration of the limitations of statistics, of the pitfalls of mistaking correlation for causation. But Darrell Huff actually went to the US Senate and testified that they shouldn't be putting health warnings on packets of cigarettes by telling the story about storks and babies and why there's a correlation between storks and babies. And it's pretty much the same as the connection between cigarettes and cancer. So that cynicism took him to a very dark place. And it is ironic that the same year that How to Lie with Statistics was published, 1954, was also the year that one of Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill's groundbreaking studies was published. Some of the first convincing evidence that smoking cigarettes will greatly increase your risk of lung cancer. So I really wanted to set these two visions of statistics next to each other and to say, look, here's a guy who tells you it's a trick and who wrote the most popular book ever written about statistics. And here are people who think it's not a trick, it's a tool for seeing what's true. And they perceived something true and very important about the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful set of contrasts that you give, and the whole book is about. I think you talk about using numbers as a telescope to open up the world, which I think is really wonderful. So the book aims to teach us 10 rules plus a golden rule for thinking differently about numbers. I don't want you to list all the rules. Your publisher won't forgive me for that. But can you just say a bit more about how you came up with the rules and what lies behind that?
Yes, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that there was a tremendously sophisticated process of figuring out what the 10 most important rules were. It was more a case of thinking about what I felt it was important to talk about and what rules of thumb suggested themselves. But there are several rules about our own emotional reactions to statistics and our own biases. So they're really rules that show an awareness of human psychology, I think. There are rules that I think are just simple practical tips for putting numbers in context and helping them make sense. Really just straightforward, down-to-earth, common sense questions to ask when you see a number. And then there are 2 or 3 rules that are about particular cases. For example, discussing data visualization or discussing algorithms and big data and what we as individuals can do to make sense of algorithms and what we should be demanding of our governments, what we should be demanding of large organizations that use them. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about any of those. But that's a basic guide. There are rules about the technical details. There are rules about this wide world of statistics and data and how it's used. And then there are rules about our own sort of biases and filters.
So I'm just picking one of the rules at random. You say ask who is missing. Can you say a bit more about that?
Oh yeah. So I think many people watching this will be aware of Caroline Criado Perez's excellent book, Invisible Women, which really starts with the observation that in a lot of writing and a lot of thinking, there's long been a default assumption that we're talking about men, and the default he in language rather than she. And Perez argues that the same thing is happening quite often in the way we conduct experiments, in the way we test algorithms, in the questions we ask in our surveys. There's a systematic, unquestioned assumption that we're talking about men and women are an afterthought. So I wanted to start with that idea and to look at all the studies that are done where there's no disaggregation of data between men and women. And recently, for example, with coronavirus, it turns out there's quite a big difference in risk between men and women, but it's quite hard to see that or to analyze it because very often the data are not disaggregated by gender. So we don't know who died of coronavirus, whether it was a man or a woman. So we're starting with that, but then saying, well, actually, what other questions can we ask about who is missing, or about what is missing? So I give the example. Will Moy from Full Fact points out that we know more about golf than we do about sexual assault in the UK. And the reason is because the survey designed to ask questions about sporting activity is bigger and better than the survey used to ask questions about being a victim of crime. And that's not because anybody in the government ever thought, it's just more important to understand sport than it is to understand crime. It's because the crime survey was commissioned by one department and they go ahead and they behave in one way and they've got a certain budget. And then when the Olympics came along, sporting participation was a big question. So we commissioned this huge survey of sporting participation. And there's no conspiracy there. It's just slightly weird and slight lack of joined up thinking. So that's another example of questions that we could be asking, or questions that we could be asking in more detail or putting more resources into asking that we don't bother to ask. I quote Anna Powell Smith, who points out that the power of governments to choose not to collect data about something is extremely powerful, and it's underappreciated just how much that can go on.
Yes, and I know she's currently working to see if we can develop mechanisms in legislation to ensure that better data is collected on a whole series of areas. So that's clearly a message that's starting to get through. One of the really nice things in your book, and I mean, this is something you do really well on More or Less and as a journalist, is tell stories about data. One of the things that you use in your book is a kind of sense of some heroes of number use and statistics and some villains. So can you tell us a couple of stories?
Sure. So you already heard the story of Darrell Huff, but the story that opens chapter 1 is all about an art forger and an art critic, and how the art critic, a gentleman called Abraham Bradius, one of the great connoisseurs of Dutch art, the late 19th, early 20th century, is taken in by a really crude forgery by just a reprehensible man who, I don't want to spoil all the details of the twists and turns of the story because it goes to some really weird places. But he's fooled by a crude forgery, and he's fooled by a crude forgery because the crude forgery tells Abraham Bradius, this art critic, it tells him something that he believed all along. It provides a sort of missing piece for a pet theory that he'd always had about Johannes Vermeer, the great Dutch interiors painter. And so this picture, he was basically being shown proof that he'd been right all his life, which is a tremendously powerful thing to be. So that's a story that I tell quite in the book, because I think remind people that technical expertise isn't enough, and you can still basically be fooling yourself. So that's one story. One of my statistical heroes is Florence is in chapter 9. Talk about her really walking this fine line between the the challenge of collecting really rigorous data really makes sense, with at the same the challenge of trying to communicate and persuade. And her data visualizations, which I've seen in the library of statistics, I know you know the raw statistics very well, Hetan. These data visualizations were just fantastic in this balance between telling the truth and at the same time trying to persuade people of something tremendously important.
Just going back to the first example you gave of the forgery, I mean, there's nothing I like more than being proven I was right all along. And it's definitely a sense of satisfaction that I get. As you say, sometimes we seek it out even when we're not right to do so. I mean, we're seeing discussions about a polarized society and people, in a sense, kind of just taking in the information that supports their views on all sorts of issues, be that climate change or Black Lives Matters or whatever else. How are you seeing that playing out at the moment? How far is this issue of us taking the evidence that and cherry picking it to support our own views? How do you see that? How far do you see that as a kind of big societal issue? And what does the evidence tell us about how we can do something about it?
I think it's a huge issue. We're highly on certain questions, and it's been quite striking, the case of coronavirus, to see how what starts as an existential threat body quickly becomes, you've got the COVID deniers, and you've got the cholerics, and you've got the people who think everyone should wear a mask everywhere, and the people who think nobody should ever wear a mask. And it's astonishing to see how quickly people retreat from evidence and just polarize into tribes. Something that affects everybody. It's not something that affects every issue. One of the things I think we need to do is to try to avoid as much as questions of evidence getting dragged into political debates. It's inevitable, but it's very unhelpful when it happens. And there's academics that I interview for the book is a guy called Dan Kahan at Yale University, and Dan studies this. He calls it cultural cognition. It's very striking to see there you've got, for example, certain that have been dragged into the political process, and you now have, like, these are Democrat vaccines. Republicans don't have them. Democrat, and then other vaccines that basically you would say, well, the scientific evidence is the same. It's all the same sort of thing. You just see if your doctor tells you to get the vaccine, and with whether political entrepreneurs have seen this as an opportunity to make political capital or not. That's a huge problem. One of the ways that we might be able to push this is, well, I argue, it's just a sense of curiosity. So Dan Kahan's research suggests that once people actually get interested, once they get curious, once they start, the world is full of puzzles to be solved or wonders covered, that's a great antidote to political polarization. The kind of data that comes in that you might go, well, that's surprising, and I can't believe it, I don't believe it, I find it threatening. Instead, you see that and you go, oh, that's a surprise, that's interesting. Tell me more, I want to know more about what's going on.
I wonder whether, in a sense, those of us that are most politically interested or active, in some ways, are the least curious. I wonder because we already have preformed views on our, and that's what the notion of ideology is. After all, it's a kind of shorthand way of looking at the world without needing the evidence.
Yeah, I think so. I suppose, but you see this in the platform of the Republican Party in the presidential election, which was, as I understand, basically our platform is to support Donald Trump, and we don't want any details. We don't need any details. We know whose side we're on, and while that I think it's a little extreme to see it stated so boldly, there's lots of evidence to show that people will support policy platforms on the basis of who they're told, which whether they think their party proposed it or not. And if I put a policy proposal in front of somebody and I say, "Oh, this came from the Labour Party," Labour supporters will go, "Yeah, well, that's very sensible." But if I tell them it's from the Conservative Party, the same people, the same policy, will completely reject it, and vice versa. So yeah, to some extent, it's a cognitive shortcut. What do people like me think? I think that's one reason why masks have become so divisive, because they're so visible. It's very, very easy to make a mask a sort of political statement because everyone can see it. And I don't think it's become especially political in the UK. Clearly, opinion is divided in the UK, but it's highly political in the US. And it is partly that you start, if you're a Democrat, you start wearing the mask as a badge of pride. I'm a right-thinking person who wears a mask. And at that point, it becomes kind of an act of cowardice or surrender for a Republican to wear a mask. Once people start feeling this way, it's very, very hard to have a sensible discussion about anything. I would emphasize, this is not true for every issue. It's not inevitable that things get polarized. But it's always a risk. And once they get polarized, it becomes very hard to have a sensible discussion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there are some issues where you can almost see politicians are trying to move out of polarization. So, for example, social care, where there hasn't really been a cross-party consensus, and I think when Labour put forward some ideas, that the Tories talked about them in terms of death taxes and so on, so make it quite polarised. But now there is a growing sense that we need to come together and look at the evidence and take some of the heat out of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Numbers obviously being bandied around all the time on the media and so on, and that's one of the reasons I think people will turn to your book. But obviously, more recently, we've seen the rise of social media. What are your reflections on how numbers are treated on social media, and how that either helps or hinders the ordinary consumer of numbers to make sense of the world?
I think if we're motivated, if we want to find out what's going on, social media can be very helpful. I mean, I think about the fact that it's just a whole bunch of epidemiologists on Twitter that I never knew existed that I can now follow and get really sensible, detailed explanations of the latest news, very, very timely, links to recent papers, etc., etc. I mean, it's fantastic. And I think that the same is true of the internet more generally. It's never been easier for someone who wants to know the answer to a question, but doesn't really, doesn't know much, to, with a couple of Google searches, to find credible sources with sort of good claims to authority, who are supplying their references, being very clear about their reasoning. Very, very, very easy to get a really expert and excellent explanation of almost any issue you like. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is most of us don't do that. Most of us, in general, use the power of the internet to read exactly the kind of thing we want to read. So we filter out unwelcome information. Either the algorithm does it. This is the Eli Paras's idea of the filter bubble, or I think a more powerful influence is when we do it by deciding who to follow, what to read, what to pay attention to. So we're filtering out unwelcome views. We're focusing on people who agree with us. That's a problem already. But then on top of that is the social media's a gift for emphasizing powerful emotion. So laughter and joy, yeah. All those cat videos and the genuinely inspirational stuff that goes around. That's great. It doesn't really help you think clearly about the world, but there's nothing wrong with sharing a bit of joy. But very often also anger, scorn, division, nasty emotions. They come out very quickly, and they tend to be rewarded. Sometimes by the algorithm, mostly I think just by you and me, retweeting things, sharing things that make us feel, I'm very passionate in opposition or very passionate in support. And you just think about people who are very widely followed on Twitter. They tend to be the kind of people who provoke strong reactions, and strong reactions are rarely the path to insight and clarity. Even though they can be the path to all kinds of good things, they can be the path to change, they can be the path to action, but they're not generally the path to insight. And you just notice how whenever something comes up that provokes scorn or anger, how much attention it gets. Observation that's a little bit centrist and perfectly kind of straightforward, it doesn't tend to get a lot of attention. Now, I think that's a big problem. And I don't know, systemically, I don't really know what to do about that. But for each individual, I think the prescription is perfectly straightforward. It's my advice in chapter 1, rule 1, which is before you're sharing anything, before you're retweeting, liking, etc., just ask yourself, how am I feeling? How is this claim, how is this tweet, this post, this newspaper headline, how's it making me feel? So if I notice how it's making me feel, I'm immediately in a little bit more control of my emotions, and I think more likely to think clearly about what's being said.
So perhaps we need more statistical cat videos on YouTube and Twitter to generate the Venn diagram of people interested in numbers and people interested in cat videos.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly nothing wrong with a bit of positivity and spreading a bit of cheer. I think certainly things like humor can be useful, and heroes and villains can be useful. Personal stories, characters, the idea of a narrative arc. It's not a coincidence that my book is full of stories and it's full of people, even though in principle it's a book advocating the use of statistics to think more clearly about the world. Well, why are there so many people in it? It's because people are interesting. And as Orson Welles says, I quote him towards the end of the book, an audience will understand anything if they're interested. The challenge is to interest them. So that's one thing we should be doing more on social media, more interesting characters, more interesting stories. Gets people involved and digging deeper, and then you can start introducing the data, the evidence, and so on. And as for humor, I suppose the cat video parallel that I come closest to describing in the book is Stephen Colbert in character as a sort of right-wing political TV presenter, really taking his audience incredibly deep into the world of campaign finance in the US by setting himself up as someone who, I want to run for president. I want to raise as much money as possible with no strings, no consequences, nothing tied back to me, and I want to be able to spend it on whatever I want, tax-free. Can you help me? And so he's getting these experts to explain to him how he's going to rip off his donors, how he's going to dodge through all the campaign finance rules, how he's going to avoid paying tax, all of this stuff. People watched it because it was funny and because they were sticking with the character of Colbert. But this has been studied. At the end of that whole this running gag that went over several weeks, people really understood campaign finance. They really understood how it worked. They really understood the problems in a way in which I think a more worthy treatment. You might have read a long piece in the New York Times, for example, would just, I mean, far fewer people would have read it. But even those who read it, I think fewer people remembered them. There's a place for statistical cat videos, I think. I think that's right.
Let me just remind our viewers that now's a good time to send in your questions. We'll be opening up to Q&A shortly. Tim, you managed to revise the book. I mean, it had mostly been written, but COVID just broke at the start of this year. So in your introduction and throughout the book, you have made some references to COVID. Can you say a bit about how you felt, data and numbers have been used during the pandemic and how that relates back to your golden rules?
Yeah. So the first thing to say is the overarching thesis of the book is that the numbers matter. They're life or death. They show us things we can't see in any other way. They're not just about winning political arguments. They're not just about tricking people or selling toothpaste. And unfortunately, the coronavirus proved me right about that. I mean, it provided the perfect example, sadly, that that's true. And so interesting just to see the scramble to understand this virus. Where is it? How many people has it infected? How infectious is it? Who's most at risk? Is it everybody? Is it just the elderly? How dangerous is it? I mean, how many people have died as a percentage of the people who've been infected when we don't know how many people have been infected? And so on and so on. I mean, these are absolutely crucial questions. And we saw politicians and their scientific advisors really scrambling to produce really consequential policy decisions in a very difficult situation because we just didn't have enough data to really be sure of the right thing to do. And whatever course we took, we were taking a massive risk. So I think that really underlined the overall point that I was making. And the fact that we tend to take statistics for granted. We tend to think of them as something that, they just did some spreadsheet somewhere, and you just go to the right website and you download them and then you've got the statistics. But they always come from somewhere. Somebody has produced these statistics. Maybe they made them up, or maybe they've done the most incredibly arduous, difficult, expensive, painstaking work. So let's not take them for granted, because we see what happens when they're not there, when the statistics aren't available. We see the consequences, having to make decisions, really life or death, consequential decisions in the dark. So that, I think, is the overall message I would try to leave people with. There have been several other examples. For example, we talked about the sex disaggregation of COVID data, the fact that many places are not splitting out men and women, and so there's vital information there that we could be analysing. Another example is the power of wishful thinking. I talked about Abraham Bradius and the art critic, and the way he was fooled by really unconvincing forgery because he fooled himself, he convinced himself. I see a lot of wishful thinking going around throughout the virus from April onwards, where you see people making arguments that it's basically not really a problem. It's not really a difficult decision to be made. If we just all ignored it, it would basically go away. And all of the different hoops that you see people jumping through, whether it's false positives, or the virus is getting weaker, or everyone's actually had it already, or it's herd immunity is just around the corner, or those people didn't die of COVID, they died with COVID. It's on and on and on. And most of these objections are, I think, on the face of it, plausible. They're worth taking seriously. They're worth working through the numbers. But when you see certain people producing one of these logical loops after another, and the evidence keeps coming in to say, sadly, I'm afraid that's not really what's happening, then you're seeing wishful thinking in action, I'm afraid.
And I suppose in that environment, as you know, one of my long-standing views has been it's unfair to place the burden on us as individuals to work out which number is trustworthy or not. for me to have to work out every number is a kind of unbearable burden to place upon me. So there's got to be a set of wider institutions in society that we can rely on, be that the media, be that political institutions and government statistics and so on, be that fact checkers. So can you say a bit about what you see as the role of these institutions in the UK and how strong our ecosystem, I think sometimes you use the term statistical bedrock, how
Yeah.
strong that is.
I think it's a mixed picture. So the very fact that so much news now goes through social media, and that it's very hard to see what people are actually reading, what advertisements they're seeing. Very little transparency. That creates, I think, a situation of great risk. There's a lot of good news as well, though. So I think, for example, many journalists are more aware of statistical questions. I think Martha Carney on the Today programme said not long ago that every time she hears a statistic, she imagines my voice sort of whispering in her ear. There's sort of become the guilty conscience of the Today programme. Like, what would Harford make of this if we got it wrong? So there's and it's not just more or less. Of course, there are. BBC has Reality Check. There's Channel 4's Fact Check. There are independent fact-checking organisations such as Full Fact. So there's an increasing awareness that you can get the data right or you can get it wrong. You can make statistical mistakes, or you can derive great insights from statistics. There's a lot of that. There's the Office for National Statistics, which I think is not a perfect institution by any means. I think you and I, Hetan, have often commiserated with each other over the quality of the Office for National Statistics website, although it's getting better. It's getting better. But I think it's in a much stronger position than it was, say, in the 1980s, where official statistics in the UK were basically regarded as the property of government, created by government for government, and not really to be shared with little people, like a management information system. So, we can publish them if we want, but who cares? They're actually for us to run the country. That was the view in the 1980s, the Derek Rayner's review of official statistics in the UK. And we've turned our back on that, I think, rightly, and embraced the idea that statistics do help governments make better decisions, but they're not just for governments. They are for everybody. They're the property of anyone in the world, but in particular, any resident of a country should have access to statistics to help them understand the world around them, to help them hold their representatives to account. And I think the ONS is doing a good job of living up to those standards. It's particularly striking how quickly they moved, I think, during the pandemic. So you've got the coronavirus, the prevalence tracker, effectively a proper, rigorously done representative survey of the population done every week, with results published every week, really give you a sense of how many people have the virus. That's incredibly valuable at a time when counts right now are a hot mess, because they're the output of the testing system and what's going on with the testing system. So there's a lot to admire. There are a lot of improvements. The Royal Statistical Society, which obviously you spent many years in charge of, Hetan, has done great work. So lots of work still to do, but lots to appreciate as well. And while my book very much emphasizes what can individuals do, what can you or I do to inform ourselves, you're absolutely right that there are features of the statistical environment that make our lives much more difficult or much easier.
Yeah, good. I can see questions coming in from our viewers, and please do keep them coming in. I've got a last question for you, Tim, which is your golden rule at the end. You've already mentioned is be curious, and you've told us a bit about why you think that's so important. Can you give us a few tips on how we could improve our curiosity?
Oh gosh, well, I think when you start asking more questions about what's going on, And curiosity is a sort of self-feeding thing, where once you start going, well, what's really going on there? And I wonder how that compares to other countries, or I wonder how that compares. I wonder how they calculate that number. It's a very interesting number. How do they even know? You start asking questions, and good questions, and the questions are motivation themselves. The answers are often fascinating, and I mean, the more you know, the more you want to know. I think because the world's a very complicated place, and so knowing a little bit about how it works just makes you more aware of how much you don't know. So I try to emphasize the curious habit of mind. I think it's very powerful, and just asking yourself whenever you see any kind of number to say, well, how does this help me understand what's going on? What is going on? Rather than, does this prove me right or wrong? Can I use this number as a weapon? Is this something I can wield in an argument? I think the curious habit of mind is, I think, ultimately a lot more fulfilling, even though it may not play quite so well on Twitter.
Very good. Let's turn to some questions from our online audience. There's several coming in. Many of them are, I think, in either the political sphere or misuse of statistics. I encourage others to send your questions in. We've got a few minutes now. So, first question, I think, is if there were any examples of egregious abuse or misuse of statistics that didn't make it into the book but stuck with you. So.
Well, there's no shortage of people misusing statistics. I guess the most obvious one to me at the moment is, just the various implausible things that people say about the virus. That most of that's not in the book because I had to stop writing in the beginning of May. So one of the things we did on More or Less was just to try to hold the government to account for the claims it kept making about the functioning of the testing system. And they kept producing these targets, which were rather arbitrary, and then rather magically hitting the targets. And then again and again, you just seem to find, well, hang on, you've only hit the target by just redefining what the target is, without telling anybody that you've redefined the target. For example, are we going to do 100,000 tests a day? But our definition of doing a test is putting a box into the mail. We don't check whether it arrived. We don't check whether the test was conducted. We don't check whether we received the test back again. We don't know what the result was. But nevertheless, we are going to count that as a test completed. I think most people would say that's not a test completed. And this matters because I think they missed their testing target by 30,000 tests, something like that. But they just defined themselves into having hit it. This is partly just frustrating because we're not getting the straight story about what's happening. We're not being able to hold government to account in the way that we should. It's partly frustrating because it just reinforces this, infuriating idea that you can't believe anything. All statistics are lies. Every time a politician lies with statistics, they are feeding into that idea that that's what you do with statistics. But the other problem is that these targets potentially start distorting behavior of the political system. I think in the case of the testing target, probably was no big deal. But the idea that we were going to save the NHS rather than save lives very quickly migrated into a lack of focus on care homes and possibly even discharging people with COVID from hospitals into care homes so that the hospitals were free and then just a major vector for infecting care homes. More recently, contact tracing, Matt Hancock has been saying contact tracing is doing well, but he started redefining his terms. So he now measures contact tracing of people as a percentage of the people who supplied their details. So if lots of people don't trust the government enough to supply contact details. And why would they trust the government, given that government is threatening them with fines and prominent government advisors have violated the rules? If people don't trust the government, they don't supply their contact details. The virus is going to spread. But Matt Hancock's target is going to show that everything's basically fine, because by definition, we've defined that as not a problem. And the issue there is when you start going, okay, well, we need to figure out how to make sure that more people give their contact details. Or in the case of postal tests, we need to figure out how to help people do postal tests and how to help people return their postal tests. Once those things are actually defined out of the system, then they're no longer a problem for the system. And so they get less attention, even though actually, as far as controlling the virus is concerned, they're absolutely central.
It's striking looking at the questions that are coming in. There's several around politicians and their use of statistics, which is what we're just talking about. I wonder if you might say a bit more. I mean, people are asking, is the situation worse than it has been in the way that politicians misuse statistics? And people are also asking, how do they get away with it? Now, I might also flip it round a bit, with the theme of your book being more about positivity. How come politicians who use statistics well don't necessarily see a reward for that? How can we encourage that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, is it worse than it used to be? Maybe. I think possibly this is something to do with just modern media and social media. I'm not absolutely sure. But I think I see more examples of politicians deliberately lying in the hope of being accused of lying, because that whole argument is then a distraction from something else. I think I see more of that. It used to be that politicians used to lie with statistics in a very subtle way and hope that nobody noticed. But now, I mean, you think about the 350 million on the side of the bus. I mean, Brexit's happened. That's all in the past. Everybody knows that that wasn't true. What was interesting was the fact that it wasn't true allowed the question of how much money do we give to the EU to be the central question of the campaign. And all of the other issues that we now realize are kind of important, like the Irish border, that sort of thing, in or out of the customs union, in or out of the single market. This important stuff didn't really get discussed because we were too busy arguing about whether that number was 350 million or 200 million. So I don't know what was going on in the minds of the Leave campaigners, but I suspect that was deliberate. They wanted to be accused of lying. And that's why they kept doing it. And they're not the only people to have done that. So that seems to be a new strategy, and maybe it's a strategy designed to maximize attention in a social media age. So why don't politicians get more credit for using statistics in a responsible way? I don't know. One encouraging development that now seems a long time ago was the emergence of the idea of using randomized trials in policy. So this is most famously in the nudge unit, David Cameron's nudge unit, but actually it was more formally called the behavioral insight team. The nudge unit, actually, for all the branding about nudges, it wasn't really about nudges. It was about trying stuff out, running small pilots, running little experiments and seeing what worked and what didn't. And that got a lot of positive press. I mean, maybe slightly too much, slightly credulous press sometimes, but I think it was really good work, it was really useful work, and it did get credit. But of course, David Cameron and nudges feels like an awful long time ago, doesn't it?
Yeah, although I'm pleased that some of that continues and the behavioural insights team is still very much there, I think. But as you say, perhaps...
Yeah, they still exist, and they've branched out internationally. You're absolutely right.
So another question is the UK education system, and then it's got a specific kind of bit to allowing specialisation in humanities from 16, a problem for producing a population in which all are reasonably numerate and understand the use and misuses of statistics? I mean, whether or not it's... humanities specialisation. But what's your sense of whether we've got a schooling system that allows people to get comfortable with using data?
Yeah. I mean, I'm no fan of that specialization. My own A levels were French and English literature, maths and physics. So you can tell where I stood. I was going to stay on the fence. And then my degree was then three completely different subjects: was philosophy, politics, and economics. Again, the classic fence sitting. All those essays about Rousseau and all that engineering maths, trying to optimize problems in economics. So yeah, I've got no time for specializing between arts and sciences at 16. I don't really understand why we try to do it, but we do it. So what can we do that's more practical? A couple of things. I think we should be trying to teach statistical thinking in lots of other subjects. A lot of people will say, "Oh, we should teach statistics instead of, I don't know, trigonometry." And maybe it's easy to say. I certainly use a lot more statistics than I use trigonometry, and I see a lot more statistics in public life than I see trigonometry. But it's a very easy thing to say. I wonder how that would work out for real. But I think there is a real opportunity to say, well, hang on, we can use statistical ideas in all kinds of subjects. The study of history, geography, political science. Any science with experiments, you need statistics to understand, to sort of collate the results and evaluate the results of the experiments, particularly subjects such as psychology. I'm minded of Florence Nightingale, this statistical heroine, first female fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. She was out in her garden at the age of 9, drawing graphs and tables of snails and insects and flowers, and just trying to understand the world around her by turning it into a statistical construct. So we could do a lot more of that. I think that's harder in some ways. It's asking more of teachers, and goodness knows we ask enough of teachers already. My book is dedicated to teachers, but I think there's promise there. There's promise for really showing people that statistics they're not just a trick. They're useful. You can use them in other contexts, and I'd like to see a bit more of that. It's very easy for me to say I'm a writer. I'm not a teacher. I don't design the curriculum, but I think that's worth exploring.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely opportunities in, as you say, some subjects like geography and psychology and others where there's growing use of large data sets, which allows you to think about statistical ideas. Now, I've got a pair of questions, which I think are slightly linked. One is, which of the traditional media do you find are generally trustworthy with their numerical reporting? You may have a bias in that, being an FT journalist and a BBC presenter, but interested in hearing that. And then second sort of question, which links a bit to it, is on the social media side. I mean, in a sense, the question is, are you optimistic or pessimistic over the long run? Are we just in a phase where there's misuse, and over time we'll kind of find better ways and the system will sort of regularize itself? Or are we always going to be in this slight cesspit of numbers that we're in now? That's not quite how the questioner asked it, but
yeah. Yeah, it's been a long day, hasn't it? Okay, so are we doomed? Look, radio was, I think, a very important medium in the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, and Goebbels was a master of the medium of radio. And I think that was partly that it was new and people hadn't built up an immunity to certain kinds of communication. And I don't think we would now say that there was something intrinsically wrong or intrinsically deceptive or intrinsically problematic about radio. I mean, obviously there were plenty of problematic radio programs, but I don't think we perceive there as being anything fundamentally wrong with the medium. Probably quite the reverse. I think it has a sense that some of our most complex or highbrow programs are radio and podcasts. So that precedent gives me hope that whenever there's a big change in media, we get savvy, we figure out. I think the basic question there is, do we actually want to know the truth? Do we want to understand the world around us? Are we curious? Or would we actually prefer to be lied to all the time? And I don't know the answer to that. I get out of it. Usually I'm an optimist, but occasionally I get out of bed on the wrong side and I think we just want to be lied to. And I think if that's the truth, then I don't think there's any particular media ecosystem that can save us. So it's one of the reasons why ultimately, for all, Hetan, I think you're correct to emphasize the importance of the ecosystem, fact checkers, journalists, and so on. I come back fundamentally to the consumer of information. In the end, it's up to us. If we want to know the truth, if we want to think clearly about the world, I think the system will deliver. And if we fundamentally don't, I think the system won't.
So we get the numbers we deserve.
Yeah, I think that we get the numbers we deserve. We get the media we deserve to some extent. As for the news sources that I trust, of course, I trust the Financial Times. I work for the Financial Times, and I think a lot of BBC output is good. But I think that and certain journalists who are incredibly smart and careful, working for all sorts of different newspapers or outlets. But I think that a general principle that's worth looking at is, if the news is slower, I think it's more likely to be right. It's more likely to emphasize what matters, like not just what happened in the last 5 minutes, but what's happened in the last month. It's more likely to have time to check. One of the advantages that More or Less has as a weekly program over, say, the Today program is the Today program, stuff's happening live on air all the time. Politicians can lie on air, and are you going to spot that they lied? I mean, it's really hard to catch these things in real time. So we can sit back, phone an expert, ponder. We're all the time in the world. So I would go for slower news sources. I write for the FT magazine, which is a weekly news source, and I like that sort of pace of news. So slow down, calm down, have a varied media diet. Try and read people you disagree with. Try and browse around and see what's going on. I find blogs very useful for that. But ultimately, if you want high quality journalism, you really need to look for somebody who is doing the things that I advocate in the book. So I'm arguing that people should be curious. I'm arguing that people should be calm, that they should put things into context. They should look for the backstory. Where did this number come from? Who produced it, and how did they produce it? And we don't, as individuals, always have time to do that. But you can see on a social media post or a newspaper article or a TV news item, you can see if the journalist is doing that, or if the journalist is just trying to give you a particular angle, or make you feel angry or impassioned about something. And it comes down to that. Do I want to know what's going on? Am I curious about what's going on? If I am, I will be able to find people who are curious too, and I should be listening to them.
Well, Tim, that's a wonderful place for us to end our session today. And of course, the thing that we must all take away from this is that the person who can help us be curious is you, and your book is, if not right now, soon to be available in all good bookshops, because it's currently sold out. Tim, thanks so much for your time. It's been a fantastic discussion about your 10 rules and how we can make ourselves more curious, and statistical cat videos, which I hadn't expected to appear, but is a fabulous idea. You, the viewers, can find out more about Tim's latest book and his articles on his website, timharford.com, and you can tune into further British Academy content on our own website. We look forward to seeing you at one of our future events. Thank you very much.